Let's head over to John chapter 19, and we'll finish out, hopefully, this chapter here. I'll probably be gone a few Sundays in August and heading back to Oklahoma City. And and so anyway, pray for that. But so we'll see how far we can get through before I take off. And so we ended right at the end of chapter 18, and that was, what's that? They're having earthquakes there now? Oh, yes. So this is just going back, submitted to his Father's will, and then went through the trials there to Annas. And then John does not talk about when he was sent to Caiaphas and then to the full Sanhedrin. But after that, then, Jesus was captured there in the garden. Talk about Peter's stumbling. And then Jesus defended the innocent. That was his men. And then he appears before Pilate. So remember when he was, Annas is where they first, probably still, wee hours of the morning. Then from there they went to Caiaphas. And then from Caiaphas, who was so Annas was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, former high priest. And so then from after Caiaphas, then Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin were assembled. And then they took him to Pilate. Jesus explains his mission to Pilate in the series of questions and answers. And then really this is a section we're at. Jesus explains God's sovereignty over all that was going on. And so the end of chapter 18 there, the Jews came, and Pilate asked them, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? And so verse number 40 of chapter 18, then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber, and we talked about him. He had committed murder, insurrection type of thing against whether Jewish, probably Roman authority there. So a number of things were going on. So then chapter 19 is where we'll start here this morning. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. So let's just read 1 through 3, and then we'll jump into this lesson. Someone like to start for us? Okay. Yes. Okay, thank you. So as we get into this, so we're still, and as far as the outline there, we'll continue there down through verse 16. So there won't be any additional thoughts there on that. So scourging, it's interesting. It's like in the Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and da-da-da-da-da. But it just says, and I think in one of the days of creation, I don't remember which one it was, but he says, and he made the stars also. And that little thing, he made the stars also. Wow, there's billions of stars and expanding billions of miles across the universe. And he made the stars also. To me, this is not quite the same, but it's very similar, and scourged him. Well, that was a horrible, horrible thing. The scourging, as I think most of you here know, was to be brutally beaten. It was what they called the cat of nine tails, which was a whip. I think it was the handle part was fairly long, not real long, but that. And then from that, and then the leather was wrapped around that, and then there was nine strips of leather that went out, and I don't remember how long they were, but at the end of those, say this was a strip of leather, they would embed either rock or stone or glass in that. And so when the whipping took, and when someone was scourged, they were often put over some kind of post where they would bend over and their hands were outstretched, so the back was taut. It wasn't loose, it was very tight. And so the result of that was they would whip that, and the stone or the glass would embed into the skin, and then they would pull it out. And so that's why Jesus had no energy to carry the cross later. Often some of the historians that I've read said there were some people who died during the scourging because they would lose so much blood. And so sometimes you could see internal organs from the ripping of the flesh and so forth. So it was a horrible thing. It's interesting that it seems as though Pilate does this so he could be released. Like, okay, I beat the guy to a pulp here, and he's barely alive. Can I release him? And the Jews said, no, continue, crucify him. So anyway, we could go into a lot of that more detail, but I don't want to right now. And so after that, then the soldiers, as it says there, they put the crown of thorns on his head and then put the purple robe on him. So purple was the color of royalty. And so we've got the crown and we've got the color of royalty. And so obviously this was mocking, and goes into the verse 3 there, and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they smote him with their hands. So all of the mockery, both the words and the actions and everything they did. And remember, the crown of thorns, the way I understand, is we had a bush in our back. In fact, we still have it there. It had little thorns on it that were about 3/4 of an inch or so. And man, they were really sticky out, because I was out there, I was trimming it up, and it's like, wow, ow, because I had leather gloves on. It went right through those. And the ones in that I understand they would use this for would be longer, thicker and longer. And so they would make the crown, and then they put it on his head, and they would pound it in a little bit. So again, the horror of the pain and the suffering Christ went through. Yes, sir.
Why is it that under Roman law, after Pilate repeatedly said he's innocent, they kind of followed him, but then he would have an innocent man scourged?
I think that, it's where they said, release unto us the King of the Jews, where you release one of them. And then they said, no, not that man, but Barabbas. So they were saying, no, we don't want that guy released. And I think the thought, Pilate had the authority, as he says later, I have the authority to release thee or crucify thee, that he was, I think part of it was history. The Jews were not always cooperative with the Roman government, and that's really what Barabbas was a demonstration of. I'm trying to remember the name of the zealots that were Jewish, and they would confront the Romans or try to get away from their authority, or plot secret things. Similar to what a little different, but similar. Remember when the Jews fasted to kill Paul? Remember, they were hiding, the 40 of them said, hey, we're not going to eat until Paul's killed. I think similar to that, they would do that, and like a Roman cohort was going down, they would ambush them. And so there was that idea. Pilate knew, if I don't make the Jews happy, this is going to cost me people, time, whatever, and it may take me out of this position of authority because I can't control these people. And so I think that had something to do with it. I think Pilate was not a strong man as far as individual, as not physical strength, but moral and being a person who would make a choice and do it. So I think that was all plays into the part where we say this obviously was not fair. I guess you could say that. I was going to bring that up a little bit later. You never find Christ in any of this ever complain, this is not fair. This is not right. He never says that about anything. And we see that because he says, my father's in charge. And wow, that's an example for us. And we know that God's will for him was to go to the cross, and we understand that. But I think there's something here that we need to learn. There's a principle bigger than that about having a sense of God is sovereign. God's going to take care of me. God's going to guide me, even though right now this is not fair. Because I was reading the other day with Israel, in the wilderness, and their complaining and griping spirit. And Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians, and and he says that this shouldn't be among us, but it often is, and so I can't answer that. I'm sort of trying to there's reasons. I think there was push and shove going on as far as in his heart about desiring to let him go, seeing his innocence, and yet feeling the pressure that he gave into. I think that's some of it. Yes.
Something, I remember when I was studying, I was reading one book about history book. The Roman government tried to be listening to
The people.
the people who was under the
Yes.
control, because they don't want these people be going against them.
Right. So as I mentioned, I think last week, that the Romans, when they came in and conquered an area, they allowed that area to be self-governing, though they would have final authority. And so they found out that was the best way to keep people in line. You guys can still rule over yourselves, though we have the final say. And I think that's somewhat of, you see that here, where they said, hey, we don't have that authority. And so we need to get your authority, Pilate. You need to sign off on this so this can happen.
Isaiah 53.
Yes. Yeah. We'll turn there a little bit later. Yes. Okay. I don't know if I answered your question, Gary, but that's about what comes to mind there. So so the purple, all of these things was a full mockery of Christ, and Hail, King of the Jews, and slapping him in the face. It was during, I think it's in other Gospels, I know they do it, and they say, prophesy unto us. I think that was the Jews. This is the Romans. I don't know if they said that. I don't know if the parallel, I didn't really look that up. It just dawned on me, where they'd slap in the face and prophesy unto us. Who slapped you? Blindfolded him first. And but this did strike me. Thinking of, and you don't have to turn there, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, where it says, if they had, talking about the princes of this world, if they had known who Jesus was, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. And I thought, you always hope these people got saved. But could you imagine if you were one of those soldiers who slapped Christ and put the crown of thorns on his head, and we're involved in this whole crucifixion and the trial and all of that one day you stand before him, because all judgment's given unto the Son of Man, and Jesus Christ, and to think that one day, standing before the one who you slapped around and mocked and made fun of, that one day you've got to give an account, and I thought, whoa, that's solemn. That's just really whoa. And yet, you and I need to give an account, and I think there's joy in the fact there is no condemnation, and that all we've done can be there, but there's still that aspect of us standing before the Lord when we've either denied him or not served him, or showed a little rebellion here and there, that all of that we comes back to us. But so let's go on. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on that? Okay, let's go to verses 4 through 6. Just go down here a little. Anybody read that for us here? Okay, Steve. Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. Something else I was going to. Again, as Gary mentioned, verse 4. Pilate says, "I don't find any fault in him." Verse number 5. And remember, at the very beginning of verse 4, Pilate went out again. So remember, the Jews would not come into his judgment hall, and so they were outside. And so Pilate, remember, he's going in and out a number of times, back and forth, between talk to the Jews, come in, talk to Jesus, back and forth. So this time, though, so they say we went back outside, and apparently Jesus came forth in verse number 5, so that means he's coming from inside to outside, and he's still got that, the implications or the aspects of being a king with the purple robe and the crown of thorns. And then it is Pilate's statement there, behold the man. And I know there's no, per se significance in his mind. He's just saying, here's the guy you guys have been talking, here he is. And just that thought of the man, and he is the man who represents us before God. He is the man who has come down in human flesh, though he is totally God. He's still that one who has, come down for us. He represents us. You could say from 1 Corinthians, he's the second Adam. There was a first Adam that represent, I think also Romans 5. But he is the man, and still has that kingly symbols with him there. And then, of course, they, in verse number 6, they say, crucify him. And now for the third time there, Pilate sort of wants to distance himself from all this. You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. So again, he said that up in verse number 4. He says that now in verse number 6. So there's no crime. There's no crime against Rome that Pilate has been able to decipher. There's nothing there in what's going on. So let's jump down a little further. One thing it does show us, though, as they were crying out, crucify him, man, they had an intense hatred. I mean, it's like the mob mentality. Maybe a few people were saying it, and now it sort of spreads. Yeah, crucify him, crucify. And so they're shouting now as it gets a little more intense. But all that hatred in their hearts now just blossoming and blooming. We'll try to get through this. Verse number 7 through 9. Let's read 3 more verses here, and anybody want to read this morning? Anybody else? Okay, Gary.
The Jews answered him, we have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was more afraid, and went again into the judgment hall, and said unto Jesus, whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer.
Okay, so it is interesting here that after the Jews say, now they give the real reason why they brought him in the first place, though they hadn't said this to Pilate yet. So, because he made himself the Son of God, that's why he ought to die. And so when Pilate said, ye take him and crucify him, I think there's a concept there. They did not have the authority, full authority to do it. And he had said, no, he's innocent. So he was not backing them. And I think, you take him and crucify him. You deal with him, I think is part of the concept, because I don't think they could. And so I think it's part of the whole, he's angry at them for even bringing this all together, because he still says, I find no fault. And so then when he says that, verse 8, Pilate therefore heard that saying, he was more afraid. So he was, and that may give you a little hint, Gary, what you mentioned. He's afraid about this whole thing. He wants to get his hands off of it. It's not good for his authority. It's not good for the nation, as far as him controlling it as the Roman authority there. So I think all of that plays in. But now he's thinking, the Son of God. Oh my. So it says he goes back in the judgment hall. So coming back to as he brought forth Jesus, apparently Jesus was brought forth before the people, and then, maybe they took him back in. And so Pilate now goes back in and now wants to ask Jesus, whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. And this is one of, the parts where he's silent for certain reasons. Now it could be because he said, more or less, he doesn't say it this way, but he already told him. Go back to chapter 18, just a few minutes before. In verse 36, where Jesus said, hey, my kingdom is not of this world. And then in verse number 37, to this end I was born, and for this cause came I into the world. So there's aspects there. Here is why I came. I'm not of this world. My kingdom's not of this world. Though he didn't say it directly, I'm from heaven, but there's implications already. And so he's not going to answer him that question again. Remember, he said, when they asked him, where was it? Verse 33 of chapter 18, art thou king of the Jews? And he says, do you say this of yourself? In other words, are you asking me this in a political sense, Roman politics, or are you asking me this in a Jewish sense? And then he says, well, am I a Jew? And so again, there's an aspect there where he's already answered some of that by implication. Something else I was going to mention. Oh, yes. Okay, I mentioned that. Okay, let's. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay, let's read the next 3 verses there, 10 through 12. Someone like to read those for us? I see that hand. Obi? Okay, great. Thank you. So again, Pilate recognizes his authority. Ultimately, he's a decider of what's going to happen to Christ as far as an earthly realm. And then Jesus said to him, you have no power against me except it were given thee from above. The lesson here makes an emphasis about, Jesus that already knows where he's going. And that there's an aspect of truth with that. But his answer goes a little bit more in the sense of, okay, there is human authority, and your position here is really God put you there. And I think all of us need to, even though, I can't remember, but I think it was Pilate who manipulated things a little bit to get in his position. So there is an aspect of that, and yet it was still God putting him there. And so we in America, there's reasons, whether it's to judge a nation or to bless a nation, there can be leaders in place that are there to fulfill that. God has a purpose beyond what we understand. I was just reading a little article the other day about sometimes we have to step back and realize God is God. I mean, God is God. I mean, that's, exclamation point. So who are you to tell him how he should do it? We all do that. I've done that in prayer. Lord, I want, would you do this and do that and do it this way and open their eyes to this and that and help them to see this, help them to do this thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, okay? So I don't think that's a illegitimate way to pray, okay? But at the same time, there is, again, as Jesus at the end, not my will, but thine be done, that we still say, hey, God, I can see this in your word, and therefore I'm praying to this end, but yet I'm going to leave it in your hands. And I know it's a little different here, but that's how, Romans 13, that's how Jesus looked at human authority. That you were put there because God wanted you there. And if God didn't want you there, he could take you out. And again, I don't, if something is evil, that I don't have a problem with praying that God would take them out. Because there is an aspect there in 1 Timothy 2 where we're praying for, a peaceable place and so forth, and the liberty to share the gospel. And if that's being curtailed, I don't think there's a problem of praying that God would open that door. And even if it meant someone taking out of office. But anyway, we can go on and on with that. So let me stop there. But notice the last phrase, therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. So I'll just open this up. I'll share some thoughts, but in what way is one sin greater than another sin? Because Jesus said that. Because sometimes let me go. Let's go back. In what way is every sin the same? Because there is an aspect to that.
It's the same.
Yeah. Why is it the same? Why is every sin the same? Pardon? Okay, it's disobedience to God. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Brother Charles? Pardon? Yes, so the penalty is always the same. So that's whether you commit shoplifting or rob a bank for $80 million? Same. Condemnation. You cross the line. That line, you've disobeyed, you've ignored God, you've missed the mark, however you want to say it. Lots of illustrations about the words for sin. But you're across the line. You are condemned. Okay? And that's why at times, sometimes you talk to a 4 or 5-year-old, that they have a sense of their sin against God because they lied to mom and dad, or they took their friend's marble, and God's convicted them for their sin. And they say, "Oh, I'm going to hell." You know, they've heard that, and they understand that. And so, man, that sin they've done, as you look at it, you say, "Well, let me just go buy you a bunch of marbles," you know, and, but that condemnation of the conscience by the Holy Spirit and the truth of the Word of God, it shows you every sin has gone across the line. Now, let's back up. Second question based on this verse: how can some sins be greater than other sins? Yes.
Well, there is responsibilities according to what you were teaching or knowledge. And the Jews have the best way to live.
Okay. So the knowledge one has brings greater the sin is greater because of your knowledge. Okay, that's obviously true. Okay, and that the more you know. So I thought, this is this earthly wicked thinking. The more you know about God and His will and His ways, the greater the sin when you ignore it, because you know it. So, I've read things like this, not quite this way, but therefore, maybe I should stay ignorant. I shouldn't read my Bible. I shouldn't be in church. And that's not good either, okay? That's purposely ignoring when you could learn more. So I guess that would make it greater as well. But yes, so knowledge, I think that's a key issue. With this, let me show you one other thought here. Go over to James chapter 1, just about sin. So James chapter 1 and verse. Let me just start in verse 13. So James chapter 1 and verse 13. Says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust," that's uniquely your own, "his own lust, and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived," okay, that's like a birth, okay, conceived, it bringeth forth sin. "And sin, when it is finished," notice the similar concept, "bringeth forth death." So conceived bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And so I think that there's two births here in a sense. There's initial birth, and that's would go with verse 14 about the lust, those inner desires, those longings that you allow to come in, and you give. How should I say it? The conception there is when you say yes to that inner lust. Okay, you haven't done anything about it yet, but someone said, "Hey, you should hate this person for what they did." Yeah, you just consented. Okay, so you sinned on the inside. Okay, and then it says, when it is finished, it bringeth forth death. And I think the finished or completed is when you take the internal desires and you act upon it, or you speak it, or something where it's more than just the contemplation inside that you're giving it your okay. It's acting upon the okay. And I think there's an essence. In other words, which is a worse sin, thinking of both consequences and connected action, not connected. I don't want to say consequence. What's another term for consequence? I'm not that thing in ramifications, something that happens, something gets hit. So in other words, if I'll just share it this way. There was someone one time who said, "Pastor, let me ask you a question." It was a young man. He said, "I was lusting after a young lady. Okay, and I knew it was wrong. Do I go confess to her, 'Hey, I just want you to know I've been lusting after you'? Would that be a proper thing to do?" Yes or no? No, I would say no. You don't go tell someone, ask any of the ladies here, would you like a man come up to you? I just want you to know the last 6 weeks, I've been lusting after you. What? All of a sudden that relationship is cut off. Okay? So what was worse, the lust inside or the lust that moved forward? And obviously, if it went further than that in a physical response, that would be a worse sin. Okay? Is it worse to contemplate someone, come back to, I mentioned about shoplifting. Would it be worse for someone to think, hey, I don't have any money, but I'd really like that. I think I'm going to stuff it in my pocket. Or to actually stuff it in your pocket and leave the store? Which is worse? Yeah, when you took it. For sin, when it's finished, bringeth forth death. There's an aspect, you conceive it in your mind, that's bad, that's sin, you confess that. But when you act upon it, that's a little step above that. So I just put the act is greater than the thought, but any sin is enough to condemn. And so as Carlos mentioned as well, so it's worse when you act upon the thought, okay? But it's also worse when you have a knowledge, and so that would be the Jews compared to the Romans who delivered him. I'd never thought of it this way, but also someone said, before the Jews had him, it could be Judas, because of his intimate knowledge with Christ, that he had a greater sin to hand him over to the Jews than the Jews handing him over to the Romans. So this is one of those passages that does say, there is a difference. And before God, yes, all sin will be condemned. But a shoplifter, if someone shoplifts, they may get fined on an earthly basis. But someone who robs a bank and maybe shoots someone in the process, they're going to spend time in prison, okay? Because that's a worse sin, and there's more people affected by it. That's the word I was looking for. So your sin, sometimes an internal sin is just you. You're struggling, yes, that may be so, but you need help with that. You need to clear the way you think. But when you act upon that, then there are ramifications with other people being hurt. And so you're also responsible. You do that act, but then this person's affected, and that person's affected, and that person's affected, and that person's affected, and that person's affected. All of a sudden, you're being held accountable for all the effects of your sin. And so all of that shows that there's sometimes a greater sin. Does that make clear? Then any questions on that? Confusing? Yes.
According to the knowledge, who is more, for me, who is more senior, the United States or a town in the Bahamas?
Yeah, that's so if you're, yes, so as a general truth, you're talking about if you live in an area that, like where the gospel's preached, are you more accountable to God than somewhere where it's not so much? And I think that would be a yes. I had an evangelist preach for me one time, and he grew up in a great big church in Southern California, and a gospel preaching, teaching church. His dad was a pastor. And he said, I always sat, and I don't think it was here. Maybe it was here. But he said they didn't have a middle aisle, and he said, I always sat like 5 rows back, right in the middle. So my dad he was always right there. And I think in his teenage years, he said, I was sitting there and I realized this would be a horrible place to die and go to hell from. Because he had all this knowledge, all the influence, hundreds of gospel messages that he'd heard, he'd seen people saved and lives changed. And he said, in other words, he got back to, I am really accountable because I've heard the gospel and I know the gospel, but I've never responded to it. And he did. And he was just telling that was one of the key things that got him moving forward. This would be a horrible place to die and go to hell from, because I know everything there is to know and how much greater responsibility. So, yes, I think there is that aspect, your exposure to that. That's why Judas is called the son of perdition. He's in a horrible place, because there was nobody who ever lived on this earth who had more knowledge and understanding and a demonstration of Christ as the Messiah. Yeah. And you wonder at times, because there's times where you go out, you thinking of where Jesus said, I think at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where he said, some will say in that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we do these wonderful works in your name? We did this in your name, and that. And he said, depart from me, I never knew you. And with Judas, I think he would fit right in there. I wonder how many miracles he saw through his hand. You say, well, man, he was a dirty vessel, unsaved person. How could he do that? I don't know. I don't know how all that worked. And I don't know. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he knew. I can't do that. And he saw the other guys doing it. And maybe that he just sort of went along. And I don't know. That'll be an interesting question when we get to heaven. To find out about that aspect of things, because you wonder. You really wonder what. Did he do a miracle? And maybe there was aspects to that, I don't know. But you wonder if there were other times he just, he was one of the ones where remember the father with the demonized boy who brought him and said, I brought him to your disciples and they couldn't cast him out. Maybe he was one of those. I'm sure there was, but there was more than just him. So let me go on, or we'll continue this for probably too long, but let's read the next down through verse 16, and maybe that'll be our close here today. So back in John 19. So we ended up in verse 12. So let's read 13 through 16. Someone like to read those for us? Okay, Carlos.
Then Pilate therefore heard that saying,
Oh, you know what? Let me go back. We didn't finish verse 12. I'm sorry. And from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. So again, he's moving forward with this whole thing. But the Jews cried out, and here's what I think is so interesting. If thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. And then later on we know that they say we have no king but Caesar. But at this point, it's like they shift gears. They just said, well, by our law, he needs to die because he said he's the Son of God. Okay, and in their mind, the Jewish, Jesus blasphemed God, saying he was God on this earth. And so if you blaspheme God, Old Testament penalty properly was death. And so that's what they're thinking. Maybe that comes in a little later. But anyway, they shift gears now. They go from saying, he said he was the Son of God, and now they shift gears and talk about Roman politics. Okay, so the whole thing is shifted because they're thinking, Pilate wants to release him. Pilate, if you let him go, then you're not a friend of Caesar. And Pilate whoa, what an accusation. I am in big trouble if that's what they're saying. And so I think, back to what Gary asked a little earlier, I think that was a powerful statement in Pilate's heart. Because if Caesar knows I'm letting a guy who calls himself a king, I'm letting him go without any correction. Of course, he already did some with the scourging. But how, this would put me in jeopardy of my position. Very much so. And go ahead.
He was Jesus forth and sat down on the judgment seat in the place that is called that Pilgrim, but in Hebrew God. It was a preparation for the Passover. And about the 6th hour he said unto the Jews, behold your king.
Okay, let's read the next two as well, and then we'll.
But they cry out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said unto them, shall I crucify you, king? And the chief of the priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And then delivered him therefore unto them to be crucified, and then to Jesus, and led him away.
Okay, so yeah, this is the final moments here. I'm trying to, something there I wanted to mention earlier. It was the preparation of the Sabbath. Now, there's 3 times, or maybe it was 4 times in this chapter, where it talks about the preparation. In fact, I'll jump ahead. Verse 31, the Jews therefore, because it was the preparation that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath day, for the Sabbath day was a high day. So earlier it talked about or verse 14, preparation of the Passover. There's another, it says the preparation day. So preparation day, the word there is the word that was used in that day for Friday. So this was the Friday, and so if it was Friday, like today is Sunday, for a Jewish person, when did it become Monday? For them, let's just say today's our Sunday. If you were a Jewish person who was, according to their long-standing way they took dates and time and so forth. Sunset. Yes, so sunset would turn into Monday. Okay, so remember they didn't want to come into the judgment hall because they'd be defiled for the Passover. So that meant this was Friday, and they would eat the Passover literally between the evenings, which, as I mentioned, between sunset and darkness. That was when it was initially said. I did read something back. The Jewish wrote down later on, they decided that noon, once the sun started to come down, that was part of between the evenings, so they had a lot more time to do the get things done. So anyway, the preparation was Friday, and the high day there, I believe it was the Sabbath on the feast day. Okay, and so that was a high day. It was more than just the regular Sabbath. It was a special day because not only was it the Sabbath day, but it was also part of the feast. Okay. And that, in this case, the Passover time. So just to see where that's at, this time frame. And then the 6th hour was according to Jewish chronology. So the 6th hour of the day started at 6 a.m. So we're talking right around noon at this time, verse 14. So the preparation of the Passover, in this case it was Friday, about noon, that he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So before he said, "Behold the man that you brought," now he says, "Behold your king," because they didn't want a king but Caesar. I guess that's the next phrase there. Away with him, crucify him. They don't want anything to do with him. And I think it was interesting. The chief priests answered and said, "We have no king but Caesar." To me, that spells out, and I know they probably said it manipulating the situation, but I think it was also telltale of their heart. We are not really religious. We're very secular, and we'll manipulate the situation based on whatever we want to do. I don't know why this reminds me. Well, we need to stop here. So they delivered him to be crucified, and they took him away and took him toward the cross. So we'll pick up there. Sorry we didn't. I was hoping to get done with chapter 19, but we're only halfway through. Sorry. But let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll move on. Father, thank you so much for our Savior. And Lord, we thank you for what he was willing to go through. We thank you that, in a sense, you have made a very physical, visible, painful death that we can consider and contemplate, for it does picture for us, at least in some way, the greatness of the pain that he faced in taking our sin upon him at the cross itself. And Father, we thank you for paying the penalty of all of our sin. And Father, we pray that you would allow us to, by your grace, to have that stir us until the very end of our life, to love you and to serve you and to follow you. We pray these things in Jesus' name.